For some ridiculous reason, I decided to strip this post and beam of all paint to turn it into a natural wood accent. It's a look that I love, and I've got many around my house. I became obsessed with the idea that this 75-year-old beam would have absolutely gorgeous grain, which it does. I mean, look at it. It's amazing. Then why a DIY disaster, you ask? For one, this was a 75-year-old beam, which meant it probably had many coats of paint. I knew of at least 2 coats because it was white when I bought the house and I added the brown. Plus, it was highly likely that some of those coats were lead-based paint. This meant that I had to fully suit up for protection and carefully capture my removed paint. This makes paint stripping a much more complex and time-consuming task. Another was that the paint hid many imperfections that I didn't know about. Much more on that later. I started stripping the beam with a heat gun, and once I got the hang of it, it was extremely efficient at removing all the layers of paint at once. Plus, it was so very satisfying watching the paint bubble up and become pliable. Unfortunately, you could only heat the paint in small sections, like the size of a Post-it or a small index card. If you tried to go bigger than that, the paint would cool down, become rock hard, and explode into brittle bits when you tried to pry it free. And you had to be careful not to burn the paint if you attempted to heat it again. So even though it was very effective at removing the paint and easy to collect, I thought it would be way too time-consuming to use the heat gun on the entire project. So I bought a can of chemical paint stripper which promised to strip multiple layers fast. From what I could see, there were 5 layers of paint: brown, white, off-white, mint green, and white. So this sounded like the ideal solution. Sadly, I instantly hated the chemical stripper. As you can see, it makes everything gooey and sloppy. You have to apply such a thick layer that's just dripping off the beam, which is not fun when it's directly overhead. And while it mostly made quick work of the top 2 layers, it had a harder time on the lower 3 layers. Plus, it was so hit or miss on how it removed paint with each application. You can see all of the various paint colors in this one section. I would apply, wait 20 or 30 minutes, and then try to remove the paint. I would apply again, wait another 20 or 30 minutes, and then try to remove the paint. After 4 times on this one section alone, I gave up on the chemical stripper and decided to go with the heat gun. The heat gun was less sloppy and you could plan your day. Once I decided to use the heat gun for the entire project, I quickly developed a system and it was mostly smooth sailing. I did make the following observations. I wouldn't use a heat gun on weathered wood like this end of the beam that sticks out beyond the roof. You can see the texture difference in these sections of wood. The heat gun works best on smooth surfaced wood that you can heat evenly. This wood was almost grooved and you needed to heat the paint in the grooves longer and risk burning the outer bits of wooden paint. Plus, you can't easily scrape the paint out of the grooves. Be careful with the heat gun when you're wearing a plastic suit. I developed this nasty habit of holding the heat gun in the crook of my arm, which resulted in me having to duct tape the burn holes in my suit. I'm doing it here, and here, and here. Here's me noticing I burned my suit, and then doing it again. I also had to duct tape the burn holes in my leg from casually hanging my arm at my side while holding the heat gun. Fortunately, I only burned the suit and not my skin, but it was supremely stupid. Looking back, removing the paint with the heat gun was so clean that I probably didn't need the suit at all. Here's the beam and post in various stages of paint removal. Unbelievably way more work than it seemed at the start. And here's a fun point of interest because there used to be a small deck here. See? There it is. It was there when I started on this beam and post journey, but it didn't make it until the end. While working, I realized that I'd never seen the bottom of the post, and since it is holding up the front of the house, I thought it might be important. The deck covered the bottom of the post, and the deck was here when I bought the house. I easily popped off this fascia board, but when I went to do the same with this board, the whole deck collapsed. So in the middle of this already overwhelming project, I had to stop and remove the entire deck. I quickly stacked it off to the side and continued forward, and this was my new workspace. Unlevel concrete and very loose dirt. After finally getting all the paint off the beam and post, it became time to sand. I felt like the sanding went on for months, just sanding and sanding and sanding and sanding. My hands were vibrating to the point that I lost all normal feeling. It was just buzzing. My upper arms and shoulders became so sore that I could barely hold them up for more than a few minutes at a time. I would sand and then my arms would collapse. Over and over, sand and collapse. Summon the strength to sand a little more and then collapse. You can see me switching hands like a maniac because I was so sore. Sanding this side of the beam was especially taxing because my head would hit the roof if I went up one more rung, so I had to stretch up, which made a grueling task even worse. I hadn't anticipated how much more difficult doing anything on this side of the beam was due to the lack of head height. Something to think about if you're about to tackle a similar project. After all of this effort, I finally set about staining the beam and post and thought that I was finally coming to the end of this DIY rabbit hole that I had tumbled down. Unfortunately, that happy thought was short-lived. I used the oil stain from my other exterior wood accents, which had a cedar tint for UV protection. This tint seemed to spotlight all the imperfections in the beam. Around every knot hole, in every crack and gouge, you could see white and hints of mint green paint, the two oldest paint layers. Mind you, this is after excessive amounts of sanding. It left the beam looking unfinished and still mid-DIY, which was heartbreaking given the amount of work it took to get to this point. The post was an even sadder tale. First, it turned out a completely different shade from the beam. I couldn't adequately capture it in photos, but it was so much darker than the beam that it created this odd disconnect. Plus, the post was full of nail and screw holes, and the filler didn't take the stain as well as promised on the package. It created a look of a pox on the post, plus dotted about were many mint green and white colored gouges. I could possibly live with the beam, but the post definitely needed more work. After trying to live with the post and beam for a few weeks, I realized that something needed to be done. It looked unfinished and was driving me crazy. Enter the flap disc on the angle grinder. This flap disc is like sandpaper on steroids. I needed to sand out these imperfections and didn't have the time or upper body strength to try again with the orbital sander. This choice did not come without its challenges. The flap disc flies through wood and makes a hell of a mess. The sawdust was falling like snow and was inches deep. Also, it's a little unpredictable. Sometimes it would sand in lovely even layers, speedily knocking out those hideous white gouges, and then other times it would get hungry and decide to take a divot out of the wood. While I have no doubt it was user error on my part, there was still no rhyme or reason to this madness. After using the flap disc, I followed up with yet another exhausting and tedious round of sanding. Then the beam was ready for stain. Since I didn't dare use the flap disc on the 4x4 post, I decided a post cover was the only short-term solution. I remembered I had some thin, rough-sawn cedar planks left over from another project. They were about the same width as the post on each side, and they were long enough to cover from the ground to the top of the beam, which I did on two sides. So I had to sand the rough-sawn finish to smooth, which took way longer than I would have imagined. But it was nice sanding on a table versus over my head. I gave the planks a coat of oil stain and then went about attaching them to the post. It was a little tricky since these long planks were not as straight as the post. They kind of had a mind of their own. But I was able to get pretty close with some clamps and determination. I was surprised at how well this collection of leftovers came together and really loved the way it looks. And here's the final reveal. And while I don't see it as a DIY fail, it definitely remains a DIY disaster. I always judge a project on whether I would do it again after knowing all the hurdles it took to get to the finish line. In this case, I 100% would not do this again. I don't even need a split second to think about it. It was a bad idea from the jump because of poor planning. I had a list of planned projects I was working on, and I threw this in thinking it would be a long weekend's worth of work. Every time I carelessly plan a project, it ends up on the disaster list. Once I realized how many coats of paint were on the beam and how stubborn the two bottom layers were, I should have bailed and just given it a fresh coat of paint. A fresh coat of paint would have taken a couple of hours. Instead, I spent weeks of effort on something that turned out fine. Okay. And now I get to restain it every year or two instead of repaint every 5 to 7 years. Great job.